Welcome everyone to this session in the Research and Teaching at UNLV series for early career academics. Today's focus is on leading worthwhile class discussions, and the method that we're going to use to think about that is we're going to actually conduct a case discussion. So we'll be experiencing case method teaching as we think about discussion. Before I engage in any kind of classroom discussion, there are really only three things that I want to establish before I get started. And I feel like if I have those three things covered, then the students understand what's happening and it's going to work out fairly well. And if I don't have one of those three things covered, then things can get into trouble. So I want to just tell you what those three strategies are in my head that I like to use, and then you can watch how I use those here. So one is just to establish a cooperative group dynamic. That, in this case, is pretty simple because you came here with a shared desire to find out something about leading worthwhile class discussions, worthwhile for students' learning, worthwhile for your teaching efforts, and you took time away from something else to come here and do that. And those people who are watching online did the same. So in many senses, you're a very willing group and you're willing to follow whatever process rules that I set out for how we go about doing this. So in terms of the cooperative group dynamic, all we really need is some shared common desire or goals, right? That is more or less a win-win for everybody there. That's easy for our group today. You might have to work a little harder at that with your students, depending on what the course is and what the particular task is that day. The second thing I like to focus on is just having some clear group goals. Now for me, that means focusing on the purpose, the task, and the criteria of the work that we're going to do together. So the purpose today, that's pretty easy. I want you to take in some knowledge about discussion leading practices and then practice those skills of discussion leading, which we'll do in the context of our case discussion. The task, we're going to do this on a multi-level kind of basis. So first we're going to read a case, a short 4-page case that is, and it's called Bound Feet for those of you watching online. That case is about a classroom discussion that ran into a problem. So we're going to have a discussion about that discussion. After that, we're going to then have a discussion about our discussion of that discussion. So we'll not just look at that case, but then we'll stop and do an analysis of our discussion of it, right? So we'll have a multi-level metacognitive kind of look at the discussion leading process. And then in terms of criteria, so you'll have had you'll have conducted those tasks. You'll have taken in some knowledge. You'll have tried out the experience of discussing in different ways. And then what I hope, in addition, we leave with is some set of collective insights that we will consciously gather as we're working our way through our discussions. So those would be your criteria for success. You've had the experience, you took in the knowledge, and then you leave with some insights. Then the last thing I like to do is, the third thing is invite the group to help me as the discussion leader, to help me monitor both the process of the discussion and the content of what we're discussing. That means that I'm not the only one that says, okay, we have 2 agenda items and we've used up half our time, so now we need to switch to the second item. It means that you help do that too. Now just to give you a brief bit of background information about case discussion method. This is a method that evolved in US higher education in business schools. So starting in the early 20th century, some of the earliest business schools began using the case method as a way of exploring business practice ideas. It has evolved to be used in both public policy school education a lot, and also very commonly recently in medical school education. And the idea is that with a case study, you automatically have a kind of relevant real-world situation so that students can look at what really happened and glean from that some insights about how the content affects them or how it might affect a real-world situation. Some of the best case discussions that I've seen, and I had an opportunity to observe lots of them when I was working at Harvard's Teaching Center. Some of the best ones happen when people work collectively on building on a certain topic, right? So that the topic is the thing under discussion and everyone adds on to that topic with new insights or critiques of the topic. And you stay on topic until you've exhausted that topic before you move to the next. Some of the worst case discussions I've seen are when the discussion is not about the topic but about the people. So people are trying to outshine one another and critique one another's ideas for the purpose of rising up and shining like the one student in the 200-member audience, right? And so, luckily we've got a good case scenario for a pretty collaborative discussion today. But this is a method that can be used both in small group discussions and in really large cast of hundreds kinds of discussions. And so for the purposes of today, I'm going to have us work not just as one whole group, but also as smaller subgroups in order to approach the conversation in a way that you could then apply or imagine applying to big audiences. So the first thing I'm going to ask us to do is to take 5 or 6 minutes to read through this short 4-page case. At the end of that time, I'm going to pull 2 volunteers from the big audience that we have, and I'll ask you to answer 2 questions, okay? So I'm going to ask Duncan? Darwin, thank you. I really need to get new glasses. I'm going to ask Darwin to start us off by answering the question, what happened? 20 seconds or less, what's the big synopsis of what happened? And then the second question, I'm going to ask Catherine to respond to that. And that question is this: what bigger issues of discussion leading teaching does this case raise? And then as we go about discussing further, we will generate the big issues for you so that our discussion will end up moving pretty quickly from what happened here and what they did right, what they did wrong, what should have been different. We'll move away from that and toward, so what issues does it raise for you that are relevant for your leadership of discussions in the classroom? Now, in an undergraduate course, you might want to stick more closely to what actually happens in the case, the facts of the case. But for our purposes, we want to move very quickly to the bigger issues as they apply to you, because that you'll get more out of the conversation that way. So any questions about what we're doing before I set you off to start reading? You're clear on what we're doing and how we're going to do it and what you're going to get out of it? Okay, so then I'm going to give you about 5 or 6 minutes right now to read through the case. After that, I'm going to ask Darwin and Catherine to respond to those what happened and what issues questions. Okay, go ahead. Now we've had a chance to all read over the case, the very brief 4-page case, Bound Feet. And I said that I would ask for 2 volunteers to answer a couple of questions about the case to get us started. So first I asked if Darwin would give us just a really short 20 seconds, what happened in brief. Can you answer that for us?
Yes. I have to hold it really far back. In the discussion of the scriptures, the lecturer or the discussion leader set a standard that she wanted people to be open and be able to discuss emotionally the material that was being talked about. And this particular discussion, one of the participants became very emotional, and over the course of the 10 weeks that they had been in class, they had learned to self-regulate any aggressive behaviors. And at this instance, she felt like she really wasn't able to do that due to the lack of respect for the different views that were taking place.
Great, thank you. And we can probably just sit the mics in the middle of the table and they might pick it up.
Yeah.
I'll let you know if they don't. So Catherine, what big issues of discussion leading teaching does this case raise for you?
Okay. A couple things came to mind.
Can you hear it? Is that coming up okay, Ellie?
Okay.
Great. Yeah, we're good. Thanks.
So one was that there had been some prior evidence that she had had difficulty with discussions. So things like maybe handling it individually in advance. So it sounded like the instructor had not allotted a lot of personal time for meetings in office hours. So it sounded like there could be some issues with just not necessarily addressing it as a group, but addressing it more specifically with the student. So how to empathize with her specific circumstances. She had some personal issues that were clearly, becoming a part of the larger discussion. So having that empathy for her, handling that privately and individually, and also picking up on things like the tone and the body language. So maybe just establishing more expectations in the class in terms of how things are communicated.
So those are a couple of really big topics. One would be just the role of the personal in a class discussion. And the other thing I hear you touching on is the control, maybe, that the instructor is exercising. And I'm trying to abstract these into big topics.
Right, it sounded like there might be some boundary issues where
Boundaries,
she
good.
hadn't necessarily established the boundaries as an instructor, and so she was having a hard time creating those boundaries in the classroom.
So that's teacher-student boundaries, the role of personal experience in the classroom. Does this, so for everyone now in our discussion group, do you see these to be big issues that matter to you, that the case touches on? And what additional topics would you want to put on our agenda for our own discussion of these issues?
I believe, is it Catherine? I think she mentioned something about empathy, if I understood correctly. I think understanding, respect, and for all of the participants, not just teacher-student boundary.
So how do we, does this sort of get at what you're saying? These empathy, emotion, respect, how to treat those when they come up in a discussion? Okay. Any other really big issues? Melissa, I see you.
Well, I was just thinking about, she was obviously, that one student was obviously a very strong force, and I felt like everybody else was acquiescing to her. So how do you allow other students to monitor in a situation like that and not become kind of subservient to a strong personality?
So it's about control, it's about power, it's about roles.
Yeah, it's enabling everybody else to monitor.
Are there any other topics that you all came in here thinking, I really want to get a better perspective on this aspect of my discussion teaching, that are not listed up there in some way?
Drawing out participation.
Okay. All right, so now what we have is the beginning of an agenda, let's say, for our discussion. So I'm going to say that this drawing out is a subtopic of control, right, and of monitoring. I'm going to say that the role of the personal and the place of empathy, emotion, respect, that's sort of connected. And then this boundaries, I think also kind of belongs under control. So essentially what we have is two big topics. One is monitoring and controlling, under which we see boundaries and encouraging participation. The other is the role of personal experience, under which we find empathy, emotion, and how you encourage respect for those. So those are our two big topics, okay? So what we've just done, backing up here to the big picture, we've established our cooperative group dynamic. You understand the goals that we have. We went through our criteria for what we're leaving with, right? And what we did was we just made these joint. So these group goals are now joint group goals, right? So we've established them together. I knew picking this case that we would come up with these kinds of issues around discussion and leading, but I didn't know that those would be the two that you really wanted to discuss. So now that we have two big topics, let's say for the purposes of this exercise, we're going to spend 10 minutes on each one, okay? And we'll flesh those two out in just a moment. And there's a couple other things I want to ask you to do. So one is everyone in the room is responsible for monitoring how we go through these two issues. How much time we spend, who says what, how many people get to talk, right? Everybody gets to comment on that. Everybody helps me monitor that. Before we get into the whole big group discussion, let's say this happened to be a lecture hall of 200-some students. What I want to do is divide you into smaller groups where each group is going to come up with 2 discussion starter statements about your topic. So let's say Group A, over on this side of the room, which was the topic that came out of this table in the first place? Do you remember which topic on the board came from this table?
Participation was from you.
And then
So it was like the control issue was more the one that got touched on in this table, or not so much?
talk about boundaries.
We talked about
Boundaries?
both of them. We fell under both.
You were under both, okay.
We had empathy under personal.
How about this table? Does this table feel like you have ownership of one of those issues right now, in particular? See, in an ideal scenario, you don't, because everybody feels joint ownership of what's on the board if this happened effectively. So I'm going to just say, since I'll go with the placement on the board. So you all are going to talk about controlling and monitoring, and you all are going to talk about the role of the personal, okay? Now, I'm going to give you, let's say, 5 minutes to come up with 2 discussion starter statements that your table will contribute. And that's how we'll start off the entire whole group discussion about your table's issue, okay? Okay, so I have asked our 2 groups to come up with a couple of discussion starter questions or statements. One of those will work. If it doesn't, we'll go with the second one as a backup. So pick the one you feel really good about, and we'll be starting with that one. And let's see. So one group has talked about the role of the personal, and the other one has talked about controlling and monitoring discussion. Why don't we start with the role of the personal? And so why don't we have this table start off our discussion. Remember now that this is the point in the discussion when the whole group is monitoring the process and content from here on out, right? So we'll all pay attention to the idea that we're going to try to split our time half and half on the 2 big topics that matter to us. Let's try doing like 5 or 6 minutes on each just to see where we get. And then if we want more time, we can do it because we have it. But if we can do it in 5 minutes just for the purposes of the exercise, let's try that out, okay? So here we go, the role of the personal.
Okay, so one of the starters that we came up with was really a question about how do you teach people that their individual experiences are respect the views and perspectives of other people in the group.
Are we supposed to be discussing these? Okay. We had a discussion here about in your conversation with your class about discussion and critical thinking, that talking about emotional bias would be something you could do in advance. So knowing that it's not that most of us might have an emotional reaction or thought or feeling about an idea, so that maybe in advance when you're like prompting the discussion, you could ask them to think about that and maybe write about that, or just be aware of that, so that when they come into discussion, you're already kind of encouraging them to think about what is my background on this, or what is my personal feeling about this. And then we talked about critical thinking being ability to being aware of that, and also not letting that cloud your ability to look at multiple perspectives.
And that difference between being emotional and talking about emotions. And you need to be clear about if you're going to be intentionally bringing that, like drawing that out on your students, you need to be very intentional about the expectations around that and kind of how that will be negotiated in the classroom.
Right, so would you say that like setting up almost behavioral kind of boundaries would be important? Like you're allowed to be emotional, but yelling at other people is not allowed, or ignoring other people or interrupting other people is not allowed. So you need to establish some sort of behavioral restraint on your emotional expression. Is that fair?
I would say yes, except that the behavioral restraint language is just, I would try to keep it kind of in the positive around like what our expectations are, and speak about it from the positive perspective.
What you can do is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that ties back into the first statement that we were going to utilize as well, where teachers really should model those appropriate personal stories and be transparent with it. If they set that tone from the beginning themselves with how they share, that could be the positive reinforcement without focusing on negative connotations.
I think, like you said, like we talked about establishing the dynamic, so you could even say specific, okay, what are examples of things that we will be looking for? So you're doing this before the conversation even starts, body language, tone, and go over that nonverbal part too, then the verbal part, and then you could almost, like, I could see maybe you'd say, okay, are you experiencing any of these types of behaviors right now or actions right now, and just kind of putting it on them to sort of self-monitor also.
Kind of to just be aware of how you're processing where the discussion is going, and using that awareness to kind of regulate the way that you're expressing yourself.
Okay, so. I didn't really have anything I wanted to say, just so now you can hear me better.
So do we want to go with that second discussion?
Sure.
It's been about 5 minutes.
Oh,
Let's do that, let's do that.
so basically just the idea that teachers should, not be afraid to talk about their own personal experiences, but also should model how to use those personal reflections appropriately and be transparent about rules and expectations, basically what you guys were talking about.
This kind of leads to one of our thoughts, which is Lisa, as an instructor, may have her own issues that she needs to explore a little bit in terms of, what her role is as an instructor, and I think her personal feelings about this topic or whatever it is, it sounds like maybe she needs to visit a little bit what her own experience is with the material and how
Yeah.
that plays out.
Yeah.
So are we now officially switching to one of your conversation starter
Since our
comments on the side of controlling and monitoring? Are we officially switching to that?
Well, John had a
Oh, okay.
Oh, I was just on that note, that is sort of similar. We were saying, if you establish your own personal kind of barriers and model that, but also make it very transparent what your thoughts are about how I share. And this is, how I tend to feel about my sharing. And I'm aware of who's in the room, not just that I and that I might, alienate them from the conversation if I went too far with something. So, I think just to be very transparent about in modeling your own. Obviously, Lisa was having some issues with barriers in the beginning, and she's working through that. So, and we understand that, Lisa. I totally am okay with you. All right. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Okay, so why don't we now officially move over to topic 2 about we're starting to get there anyway. So we're talking about controlling and monitoring.
So our first statement was Lisa's lack of boundaries in and out of the classroom impacted her ability to read control of the discussion.
That kind of, it seems to fall under some of the things that we've talked about already, kind of ties in the boundaries with the control.
Maybe a follow-up to that could be, what are some of the specific ways she did not maintain boundaries that we could learn from ourselves in terms of instructors? I would say having her phone number, giving out her phone number is definitely not usually a good idea. So that was definitely one thing that stood out to me.
Well, I'm less concerned about her providing her phone number, but the fact that she told them they could call any time of the day or night. Their answering machine would filter the calls when she was busy or asleep. So even that could be done where it was a little less like, here's my life, take it.
That's exactly what she did. She was like, here's my life, take it. She was willing to put her work behind anything else that her students were doing. And it's like the parent trying to be the son or daughter's best friend, you know what I mean? And sometimes that's not the most effective way to be an authority figure.
And sending the message that the student's needs are always, any time of day, gonna come before her own, I think kind of led to that lack of control. Because then when a student got emotional in the classroom setting, they had already been given the message, your needs are going to come above mine. And so I think that that's kind of how that progressed.
And it seemed like she might have wanted, to be liked, and therefore confrontation could have been difficult for her because the way she handled the student that did express concern, she dealt with it more as a blanket statement to the whole class. And, I think she could have benefited from a personal meeting with Meryl, more one-on-one in privacy.
Yeah, or use her phone calls with her.
Yeah.
Opportunity.
Meryl may
that-
not, if you make a
she-
blanket statement, Meryl may not realize that you're talking to her. So
Yeah.
it may be completely.
Right.
She had noticed those behaviors in the past and had just failed to address them over the previous few weeks.
Yeah,
It had
specifically
been popping up.
with Meryl, yeah. She saw the writing on the wall, and I think, she was sort of, and obviously Meryl, I'm not making huge judgments against Meryl, but I'm just saying that she may not be the most self-aware. So when she said, let's not get too, too hefty with your comments, I think, that probably went right past her.
And the joking way that they would monitor each other, like it was not very like, oh, let's not get too aggressive.
It made fun of it,
Yeah, not being very serious about it, allowing it to be very light, instead of a real monitoring kind of situation.
Well, Beth brought up a good point, that it was hard to tell whether Lisa was unaware herself that she was not dealing with these issues, or she was avoiding it because she didn't want to deal with it and didn't like confrontation. So she herself sounds like she could use some mentoring as far as, being an instructor, being aware of what she's doing.
I noticed on the last page, the little transcript section, that Lisa tries to kind of guide the discussion, wait a minute, and she's focused on speaking softly and calmly and not having jerky movements, not seeming aggressive in any way. But wait a minute, we're getting at a very interesting problem here. And only addresses it in terms of the content, and clearly Meryl is very, very emotional right now and is not responding to that. So there needs to be some more direct addressing of the problem. And I think while we do want to have that group monitoring, ultimately it's the instructor's role to take control of the ship be a little more clear about it when it's necessary.
Yeah, I'm almost wondering if there would have been a place somewhere, like before it really escalated to the point where Meryl yells at Ian, or there would have been a break. You know what I mean? Let's just take a break, let everybody calm down for a second, and then maybe talk to Meryl after she's had a few minutes to simmer. Talk to her one-on-one and then bring her back into the discussion group, or actually maybe even like tell her that if she's too emotional right now, she can go home for the rest of the day, right?
Yeah.
And let the other students have a chance to leave talking about the discussion without her, without being afraid of upsetting her.
Yeah, I was thinking it might have been a really good time to say, okay, everybody pull out paper and a pen, and I want you to think about this question, think about it silently. And, you know, we can do this for the next 5 minutes, and then that'll give everybody a chance to calm down, and it clears the air.
And it gives them a chance to focus on that one point.
Right.
Dissipate the bad emotions. And then we can redirect the discussion if you pursue it again.
Yeah, and when you come back to the discussion, okay, so we've all had a little time to process, let's come back to this and let's remember our group norms for discussion, we're gonna be respectful and this is what it looks like.
Is it Melissa?
Yeah.
Okay, Melissa, you had talked about drawing out participation because I'm sure we've all been in this situation where one person's dominating the conversation and now we're losing other students. So, you know, it sounds like one thing could be just stopping in general, taking a break, writing. Do you all have any really good ideas as far as like when you're feeling like you're starting to, because it definitely sounds like maybe just kind of getting Meryl taken care of would help the group feel like they could have a better experience. So it's sort of.
Yeah, you know, Delmer and I were talking about before at this session actually about these things that apparently are called minute papers, where you give your classroom a chance to just write on something for a minute. And maybe just when you feel like you're losing control, having the group just take 1 minute and just address this thing. Because I find it's often easier for students who are reluctant to talk out in class to just read from a piece of paper, right? Like, so if they have their thoughts written down, then you ask them, what did you write down? Instead of even necessarily, and we should always ask them what they think, but what did you write down is sometimes a little bit less intimidating for somebody than what is your opinion on this, you know?
Yeah. Or think pair share, where they pair up into twos rather than, you know, a huge group. I don't think in this circumstance to say, you know, the poor person who would be teamed with Meryl at that point would have been bad. Yeah, it would have been like me. I'd have been like, all right, Meryl, let's take it down a couple notches, okay? We've all had a rough week. But yeah, I think that's also a good way to sort of draw out participation too for the less talkative of the group. Because if they get to do it with just one person, it's helpful for me too, I know, personally.
Great. Okay, I'm going to intervene now. I know that we could keep going, but I was trying to get us to divide our time more or less evenly across the 2 topics so that we would gather some insights. And now we've got 2 tasks left. So one is to just name those big insights that came out so we can put them, I've been jotting down some of them, but, and then the other task is I want us to have a 5 or so minute analysis together of our discussion, which means that I want us to talk about my behavior as a discussion facilitator and how that affected you, your reactions to when people said different things, and I also jotted down some comments about the way that you all were interacting that we could talk about as well. So how about if we start off actually by analyzing our conversation, and then we'll conclude by pointing out what were those insights we're walking away with. Does that sound like a good plan? Yeah. Okay. So what would anybody like to offer about the process of how we pursued our discussion? You can start off with observing things that I did or didn't do, how you felt in reaction to what I was doing. That might be a helpful place to start.
Well, I thought that you did a really good job in the very beginning telling us what our task was and then kind of describing where you saw the discussion going.
Okay.
To describe kind of like the overall purpose of what we were trying to do. I think that helped us kind of, you know, follow that in a sense, but also allowing us some flexibility to talk about
Mm-hmm.
things that we want to talk about as well.
And some ownership too, which was nice.
work in small groups, and then, because I do think that's really effective for particularly students that aren't as comfortable speaking in larger groups. They're often very willing to participate in a small group, and then the more, student that's more willing to talk will be sort of the one that talks for the whole group, but then you do feel like you get good participation in all levels.
And then you kind of let it roll
Right.
after that, which was,
And what did you think was going on when I suddenly sat down and started writing things as opposed to standing up and talking?
You were letting us guide our discussion.
And that you were observing us.
Okay.
I feel like that's something that works better with this crowd, you know?
Right.
If it were students, I would tell them exactly what I was doing.
Right. I didn't tell you.
With that.
I didn't
So-
tell you what I was doing.
So it's important
So you
to think
could
about
have
your
been,
audience.
yeah, students could be really paranoid about what is she writing down about me right now? And I wondered if I could make you feel that way. So, and maybe if you secretly felt like, what is she doing? Why did she just switch from one mode to another totally different mode? Like, that might make you think that you'd want to clarify to your students, I'm going to do something really different right now, and here's why.
I think it's important too to, that boundaries again, there's a way to sort of maintain control of the classroom without it seeming like you're controlling it. And like, for example, when you walked around, if you give your students group work, you don't just walk out of the room because it could turn into chaos, or you have that one student that's overpowering. So I think it's, it's being present, it's being engaged, it's being visible, still kind of standing up and walking around and all that, I think is really good, at least in my experience with first-year undergraduate students, where you're still showing a presence in the classroom, that you're not disengaged, you're aware of what's going on.
I did notice that there was a kind of back and forth pattern to the way that you were commenting. At first it was almost like a tennis game, right? And then there was a moment in my head where I was aware that there was one person left who hadn't said anything, and that was Beth. And it was just at the moment that I began to think about that Beth spoke up and said something really intelligent. Not that, everything was, but like, it was like, okay. She was waiting with that one, and she had a good, and when we go back through the comments, I will tell you exactly what that was. But, so I'm not sure how you managed to do that, but I felt like there was an equal amount of participation from sections of the room, from topics that were represented, and from individuals, because it was a small enough group that we could even get down to the level of individuals. Did you feel at any point underrepresented, or like there was something got skewed in one direction or another? Were you watching out for it?
I do. I tend to be a talker, and I self-monitor. So that's just something that, having done a lot of discussion, something that I'm aware of.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's easier to pay attention to those dynamics when the expectations and the structure of the discussion is kind of laid out in advance. So I think that helped facilitate this, at least from my perspective, is, when you have an outline and you know what's going on, it's easier to be aware of what everybody else is doing and engage, in an appropriate way.
I would say that's something that, Lisa could have benefited from, is maybe providing a little more of a framework for the discussion, like you modeled for us, in terms of taking our ideas, but then putting them into two broad concepts, and then giving us some structure with our groups, and then some time frames. And I think that might have helped in terms of giving that conversation a little bit more structure.
So there was no point at which you felt like, where are we and what am I supposed to be doing now? Okay. I think, Darwin, I got the sense that you were aware that we didn't spend our time totally equally on both topics. I saw you looking at the clock right around the time I was looking at the clock, realizing, wait a minute, we're more on topic 2 than we are on topic 1. Was I imagining that, or were you monitoring
I was
it?
checking the-
Okay. But you let it go?
I did.
Okay, why?
Because I thought the avenue was fruitful that we were taking at that point, and in the scheme of discussion, it can always come back around. If it doesn't, it's something that you can readdress yourself. That was my personal reason.
And that was actually why I let it go longer as well. I thought, this is productive, we're getting some good insights, so we're gonna stick with it a little longer. But there might have been some value in my saying, I know we're at time, but we're gonna keep going, right? Depending on, at an undergraduate course, that might have been worthwhile, because they might have watched the leader breaking his or her own rules and thought, okay, well, if they're not gonna model the message, why should I be so careful to watch? But with this group, it felt like we were on the same page enough that, right? So I could have been more controlling, and probably would have been, had it been a less experienced group. Any other comments you would care to make about our process or insights that you gained from it before we go back to the topics and gathering those insights?
I was just thinking with your undergraduate comment, I don't teach full-length courses here. I'm a librarian too, but my background is as a high school teacher. I'm just thinking about the structure we followed here, and we're pretty adaptable as adults. But for students, when you're with them over time, it's really helpful to have these structures that you use again and again. And as they, especially with undergraduates and younger students, as they get comfortable with that, they're so much more successful within that framework. So to not necessarily hop from idea to try out one idea after the next, but to try something a number of times.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so why don't we go back to our topic of the role of personal experience, and I'll ask you maybe to just name one insight that you're leaving the room with on that topic that you find to be helpful as you go off to pursue discussion teaching in your classes.
Well, I do really like the writing part, and I use that now, but I think I could use that more in the middle of class too, where I do think I'm a very extroverted person, and I have a lot of introverts in my classes, so I've learned to be really, really aware of how they prefer to communicate, and I agree with exactly what Melissa said, is they prefer to write and then first, and then think through their thoughts and then share. So, and I think that's a good way to balance emotion and balance participation, and so I think just, continuing to use writing as a way in class to be engaged.
I liked your idea about me addressing emotional bias in advance of talking about it, just acknowledging the fact that sometimes we can become overly reliant on our personal experiences, and it not necessarily clouds, but influences the way that we think, and knowing about that and being aware that that might happen is important to understand. And the idea of being emotional versus talking about emotions is something I wrote down, because that's something I never really thought about, so that's helpful.
That was the same for me. I like that, talking about things as opposed to being emotional.
I really appreciated Samantha's distinction about feeling the emotion versus talking about the emotion, and how that's a helpful way to explain to students. And then also Melissa was talking about explain it, name it, and then also model that behavior. I appreciated that a lot. And John reiterated that too.
Yeah, I think that's my takeaway.
I like that we're sort of crediting people for ideas, and I noticed how you did that even during the discussion, and I really appreciated that. And as I look back over the ideas, I like that it becomes, in my notes, harder to distinguish whose original idea it is, because we're building on the idea, and that's how you want it to look by the end of the conversation, that everyone has helped to construct that view or that idea. All right, how about on the side of controlling and monitoring? So we've already, I mean, Catherine's comment about strategies of writing, or what John said about 5 minutes, also play to the control side, as well as they do to the role of the emotional side. Good insights for how to control a discussion.
I think for me, really the need to be an authority figure is particularly important. How to kind of not, the necessity of confronting things when they come up, as opposed to waiting, has been kind of important, because I'm not always very good at that. And I've seen in my own personal experience how that can cause problems later. So that was important, the need to address issues in a timely manner, and not try to be somebody's friend, and try to
Yeah.
instead establish authority.
Right. It's funny that our conversation about the control was, for a while, it was about naming the things not to do. Because it was naming the things that this teacher should not have done.
Yeah.
Right? So now we need to flip it around and cast those as positive strategies. Right? So confront something when it arrives and address it when it arises.
I really liked Catherine's point of addressing it one-on-one as opposed to as a group, and making those sort of blanket statements, because I think that that's far more effective, but doing so in a respectful way, obviously. That's good.
And I really thought it was a helpful strategy. I think John said it, where if the class is getting out of control and there's an emotional person like Meryl, that, you know, you can take a break and then have everybody take a 1 minute or whatever length of time to write down what it is that we're talking about, or that the class is talking about, to kind of refocus everybody.
Mhm.
Meryl Streep. Every time we say Meryl, I just keep thinking about Meryl Streep. And how dramatic she is.
This is not Meryl.
This is not that Meryl. This is like maybe Meryl in Doubt. The River Wild Meryl. Like, it's this Meryl.
So what other good control strategies do we have? Any other control insights? One I had was not to joke about the process, right? To give it the gravity that it deserves. So you talk about it, you explain it, you discuss it, you get your buy-in, and then you model it.
And yeah, I think to not let that go when people started joking about the aggression. Was that the term, the aggression?
Mhm.
She didn't, she kind of
Not
let,
too
yeah, she let
aggressive.
that go instead of confronting that. I think probably if you set a boundary or a rule, then,
Yeah.
She saw that as evidence of camaraderie, but
yeah.
in terms of control, being clear.
And maybe, I'm sorry, please, I'm interrupting. Maybe like addressing it, kind of the elephant in the room. Like I use that strategy a lot, where I'm just kind of like, wow, I can see this is a really emotional moment. Let's just take a moment, you know, like not running away from it, but addressing it. But then, you know, maybe it would be a good time to say, let's take a break. Why don't we get some water? You know, but just really being like, not pretending like you don't know what's going on, but acknowledging it, because everyone's thinking the same thing.
Mhm.
I think that's tricky sometimes, is getting that, finding the words, or, you know, I get sometimes I'll just, if we're off track so badly, I get so nervous. I don't know what to say. I know how before I was like, oh, just have them right. I get really nervous. So and there's some, like, I always try to think of like really good cues that I'll have in my back pocket that'll help us get back on track, you know, or what I would say to help get a conversation back on track.
And each of you had 2 possible questions that you came in with to start the discussion, right? So you had your question and then your backup question. So maybe this is a way of having a couple of backup questions ready to go, or
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I had a really great discussion leader once too. This was her thing, where she always said, I'm just going to shift the conversation right now. And it worked like a charm. And then she would have her backup. And, yeah, it was good, and the hand gesture just really worked. So that was, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is the right way to do it, but sometimes when things start getting off track, I will respect, the fact that they don't have that as well. Maybe I'm gonna have 2 more people talk about it, and then we're gonna talk about something else. You know what I mean? So maybe like give me saying, I'm open to listen to this, but we need to
Right.
move on to something
Right.
else. I don't know if that's right. I don't know if I'm like privileging people.
Well, if you have a sense, an agreed upon sense of what the main point of the class is, and, we had 2 main points that we were going to go after. So if you can say, all right, we've agreed collectively that these are our points, so let's do this for a while, but then we are going to return to this thing that we agreed on. So I think it's a really legitimate thing to say, this is productive, we'll take it for a while, but we're not going to skip the things that we agreed to do. I think that works.
I think you can preface, like, the way you prefaced how we should go about doing it, let the group monitor themselves so that someone should feel empowered enough to address the fact that we're gearing off topic. And then you can always just do a blanket disclaimer saying, I'm willing to talk to you outside of class to acknowledge people's levels of engagement on the issue.
Good. Okay, so we have covered 2 topics. We have some insights that I will type up and put on our website along with the case. And I'll call attention to the 1-page handout that you have called Leading Worthwhile Class Discussions. On that, we have some links to the full text of these articles and web publications. I think some of them that would be particularly helpful given the direction that our conversation took are the last 2 on the bibliography, the Managing Hot Moments in the Classroom and the How to Lead and Guide but Not Control and Direct. Right? I also want to acknowledge the contact people at the bottom of the page who helped put this session together and who provided support for our discussion. Samantha Godby, who's an education librarian, John Watts, who's an undergraduate learning librarian, and then Ann Mendenhall, Director of Online Education. Many of the ideas that we talked about apply also to principles for online conversations. So thank you, all of you, and look for these resources online in less than a week.
Thanks, Marianne.
Thank you.
Good job.